Hey guys, this is James with thegraymattersblog.com coming to you on another one of my walks through the beautiful South Texas woods. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about fantasy combat and how to make it a little more interesting, a little more awesome, and a little more historically accurate. This topic actually won out in our poll, which we had kind of asking everyone what they wanted to hear about. The other subjects are totally going to be covered in videos, possibly even coming next week. So don't worry, if one of those you're really excited about, they're still going to happen. So, talking about fantasy combat, there's a whole lot of stuff from medieval era combat, ancient era combat that's just totally passed over in most fantasy. Because most fantasy is kind of Lord of the Rings inspired, kind of Dungeons and Dragons inspired, although it doesn't even really dip into all the awesomeness that Dungeons and Dragons can bring into it. Because I think we've all seen all the fantasy where it's basically a bunch of guys wandering around the countryside in full armor, maybe with shields and swords, maybe one guy has an exotic weapon, and that's pretty much it. And there's so much more to fantasy combat, to ancient combat than that. So here's a few things you can kind of do that will put interesting thing, if you're writing fantasy, a little more interest, a little more accuracy into your writing. And also just that I really wish I could see more of the big writers actually do. One of the first things is variety of weapons, like I hit upon a little bit just before in this intro, which is there are way more weapons than swords. In fact, swords were mostly sidearms. Now they're super famous, whether it be a knight's, arming sword or longsword, or whether it be a samurai's katana. These were really important weapons to them, but they were mostly either their sidearm in combat or what they would carry day to day to defend themselves if, say, they got jumped by bandits or whatever. This wasn't really a battlefield weapon. Like I said, not that they wouldn't use it on the battlefield, but they almost always had something else that they used first and then only used that if they absolutely had to. Write a little bit of a crossroads here. Insert crossroads demon, crossroads fairy, trope or joke of your choice. We're going to take a right and hope we don't, run afoul of any crossroads demons, fairies, or what have you. Anyway, so swords, when it comes to fantasy, is kind of overrated. So what else can we give our adventurers, give our main characters, give our protagonists? And the answer is there's so many things, almost anything. It really depends on your era, which is another thing I'd really like to see more eras being explored, because it's all based off Tolkien, which is based off medieval Europe. Game of Thrones is based off medieval Europe, when in reality there's so much more. For one, there's surprisingly little fantasy based in Rome. And which I can't believe that there's so little based actually in fantasy versions of Rome, when that would be such a rich period. But so let's just start with medieval. Okay, if we want to have a medieval fantasy combat setting, what can we armor people with? Well, first of all, the main weapon that most people, knights included, would have been armed with is a spear. Now, whether, depending on period, is what the spear would look like. A knight from horse, if he's from the 11th century, would carry something that we would look at and really call a spear. If he's from the 16th century, we would look at it and call it more of a lance, but it still really did the same job. Spear is one of the best weapons for untrained peasants because it's so easy to use. It has reach, and just the stick the pointy end in the other man actually does work pretty good if you're using a spear. Not so much if you're using a rapier and are a fan of Zorro movies. But spears, super accurate. So both for low skill and high skill people, that's a great way to go, is to arm them with a spear. But there were also just tons of weapons. The Bec de Corbin was basically a hammer and pick mix. Halberds, pikes, which were very long spears. Halberds, of course, which is basically an axe and a spear combined. And there's just thousands of even just medieval style weapons before we even get into things like Iron Age, which is, of course, kind of the Roman era, what we usually think of as the Roman era. And that's going to be, once you get into that era, now we're talking such a huge variety. Swords were used a little more because that was one of the main Legionnaires' weapons. But if we want to look at some really interesting exotic weapons we can put into fantasy, slings. Slings were huge in the Roman era. In fact, every Legionnaire had to be a slinger. Every Legionnaire had to own and know how to use a sling. So that was a really huge part of it. In fact, in that ancient era, in the Roman era, a lot of people figured that bows were actually inferior to slings, that slings had better range, better accuracy, and better lethality, which was sometimes true and sometimes not. It depends on how good your bow was. But during that period, there's such a huge variety of weapons. And like I said, slings came in varieties. Depending on how long the sling was how big a stone. Some of them were throwing things that we would look at and we would definitely call it a cannonball. There was also a type of sling called a staff sling, which is about like a 4 to 5 foot stick that has a sling attached to the end, which is a really cool weapon. There's a YouTube video, I highly recommend looking it up, of a guy using this, and he's slinging tennis balls over the horizon. So this thing could have easily been throwing things that would have looked like cannonballs. I don't know if it shows up on the camera, but we've got a giant spider web we're having to walk around here so we don't disturb the little guy. Now, as I was saying, slings are a great weapon, highly underestimated. About the only reason I think most people have ever heard of the sling is due to the fact that it's the David and Goliath weapon. But one of the reasons it was used in that story is because at the time it was considered the advanced artillery of the era. But whether we're talking Bronze Age, Iron Age, Medieval era, there are such a huge variety of weapons. Also, whenever I was asking people about this, there was a ton of interest in early firearms. So apparently, Matchlock Fantasy, Flintlock Fantasy is another term for it, is apparently just a genre that has a huge amount of interest in it. So if you're ever considering what to write and wondering if there's an interest in it, if you have any interest in that, basically, and this is fantasy set in the era where there are early firearms, would probably be a great thing, because like I said, I just had a ton of people wishing they could see that more. But so many different weapons, everything from medieval man catchers, which was kind of like a two-pronged spear that you used to hook people's necks, to a German weapon called a Gutentag, which was basically a giant club with a spear spike at the end of it that at least purportedly men would yell "Good day, sir" in German before they beat you with. So tons of really cool, really interesting weapons, much beyond just the basic longsword and shield. So have some fun, do a little research, check out some of these weapons, and that kind of goes a long way to actually adding some interest and some awesomeness to your fantasy. One of the next things is a battlefield is not day to day. And when we say that, what we're talking about is the way we see a knight dressed, or a samurai dressed, or a Spartan warrior dressed on the battlefield. He usually didn't walk around like that. Maybe if he was actively doing some kind of guard duty, maybe. But in general, traveling, he was not wearing full plate armor. He was not wearing full bronze armor. This was just not something people wore. It wasn't practical. Where you would be wearing normal clothes, and you might wear something like a leather buff jacket, or maybe even a gambeson, which is quilted. Basically, it's the equivalent of wearing armor that's essentially a really heavy woolen coat. But you might wear a little bit of light armor, but your big heavy armor you would not be wearing day to day. It was brought with you to the battlefield, and you wore it in battle. This was actually to such an extreme that a lot of people don't think about. In the Bronze Age, when there was a ton of chariot combat, people probably picture that, guys rode in on their chariots and into battle, when in reality there were big ox or onager-drawn wagons, an onager is like a donkey, that they would actually load the chariot, sometimes the horses, into this wagon to be brought to the battlefield. Kind of the equivalent of putting your sports car in the back of a pickup truck. Because the chariots were delicate and the horses were high performance, and they didn't want to risk them, say, breaking a leg while just traveling to the battlefield. So just because a knight might be invincible in his plate, which knights were not invincible in his plate, there were things like the Bec de Corbin, which was basically a weaponized pickaxe, that were pretty good at acting as a medieval can opener, that even if he was invincible in his plate, he wasn't wearing that plate all the time. So that's really something to keep in mind. Even if your character has a magic weapon or magic armor, the odds of him having that with him at all times are very, very low. Now, this is where magic swords make a lot of sense, because a sword is a sidearm. So I think keeping that in mind, though, for your fantasy is a really good idea. Just the difference between daily wear and battlefield wear. Finally, one of the other things I want to bring up that sounds so boring, but I think has a ton of potential, which is logistics. Everyone thinks about these giant armies, which usually are way too big for the historical period because most of the armies weren't that big. And they don't give any thought to how these guys were getting fed, how these guys were getting clothed, and where they were getting water from. They don't give any thought to how they were trained. Just, okay, this guy shows up and he's got 30,000 warriors with him. Well, where did those warriors come from? Are they conscripted peasants? Are they mercenaries? Are they like Spartans and they're a dedicated soldier class? All of these are really important and really cool and can add a lot of depth to your story. Simple things like, how is that army? Well, if they're in enemy territory, they're probably what they called foraging. Now, when an army says they're foraging, it doesn't mean they're picking berries and hunting deer. When they say they're foraging, they mean they're going to farmhouses, killing people, and taking their stuff. This was something you generally only did in enemy territory, although if they were hungry enough, they would do it in normal territory, in their own friendly territory too. So that can cause some really wonderful conflict and add a lot to a story. Training, now that has been touched on some, there are some great stories about the guys going through the medieval military boot camps. So those are pretty cool. And then the aftermath of battle, actually having to deal with wounded people, having to deal with people getting infections, having to deal with the lack of medical care, which is something you got to worry about. All right, guys, coming up on a little water slick here, which I'm actually going to just boldly tromp on right through, because as you can see, wearing my rubber boots, so I'm not too worried about it. But anyway, in medieval times, unless you're adding a magical element, which can be a really fun element to add, but unless you're adding a magical healing element, we're talking people getting wounded and getting infections, getting horrible diseases, having to deal with diarrhea, which was one of the biggest killers in armies. So you have this really cool, really rich logistical element that can add a lot of conflict to your story. So anyway, guys, that's just a few of my thoughts. This is such a huge topic. I will 100% be revisiting this and adding other ways to add awesomeness to your fantasy combat. But this is just a few thoughts. If I forgot your favorite thing, if I forgot anything you're thinking about, drop it in the comments. Let me know other ways to make your fantasy combat awesome. So give us a like and a subscribe. It really helps us out. Make sure you check us out on our blog and on our Facebook group, and I will check you guys on my next walk.